Dark Cast Network. Out of the shadows comes the best of indie podcasts. The Bender family, more well known as the Bloody Benders, were a family of serial killers in Labette County, Kansas, from May 1871 to December 1872. The family consisted of John Bender, his wife Elvira, their son John Jr., and their daughter Kate. While there is no definitive number, estimates report that the Benders killed as many as 20 people before their crimes were even discovered. The family's fate remains a mystery as well, with theories ranging from their deaths at the hands of justice to a successful escape. Much folklore and legend surround the Benders, making it difficult to separate fact from fiction. My name is DJ, and this is the Mythical True Crime Podcast. In October 1870, 5 families of spiritualists homesteaded in and around the township of Osage in the northwestern section of Labette County, approximately 11 kilometers northeast of where Cherryvale was established 7 months later. One of these families was John Bender and John Bender Jr., who registered 160 acres of land located adjacent to the Great Osage Trail, the only open road from traveling farther west. After a cabin, a barn with a corral, and a well were built, Elvira Bender and her daughter Kate arrived in that fall of 1871. The Benders divided the cabin into 2 rooms with a canvas wagon cover. They used the smaller room at the rear for living quarters, and the front room as a general store where they sold dry goods. The front section also contained the kitchen and dining table, where travelers can stop for a meal or spend the night. Elvira and Kate also planted a 2-acre vegetable garden and an apple orchard north of the cabin. Now, multiple sources state that John Bender Sr. was around 60 years old and spoke very little English. The English he did speak was guttural and usually unintelligible. According to the May 23, 1873 edition of the Emporia News, he was identified with the name William Bender as well. Elvira Bender was 55. She allegedly spoke little English and was so unfriendly that her neighbors used to call her a she-devil. John Bender Jr. was around 25 years old and handsome, with auburn hair and a mustache. He spoke English fluently with a German accent. He was prone to laughing aimlessly, which led many to consider him a half-wit. Kate Bender, who was around 23, was cultivated and attractive, and spoke English well, with little accent. A self-proclaimed healer and psychic, she distributed flyers advertising her supernatural powers and her ability to cure illnesses. She also conducted seances and gave lectures on spiritualism, for which she gained notoriety for advocating free love. Kate's popularity became a large attraction for the Benders Inn. Although the elder Benders kept to themselves, Kate and her brother regularly attended Sunday school in the nearby Harmony Grove. The Benders were widely believed to be German immigrants, with no documentation or definitive proof that I could find that their relationships with one another, or where they were born, has been found. John Bender Sr. is either from Germany, Norway, and some reports I found in the Netherlands. He may have also been born John Flickinger. According to contemporary newspapers, Elvira was born Almeria Hill Mark, often misreported as Meek. She married Simon Mark, and of these rumors which were proven, Kate was purportedly Elvira's 5th daughter. Some of the Benders' neighbors claimed even that John and Kate were not actually husband and wife, but brother and sister. From those who knew them, and have written about the Benders, they were quoted in saying, quote, "The old man was so repulsive, a hideous brute, without a redeeming trait, dirty, profane, and ill-tempered." Others have said that, quote, "Old Mrs. Bender was a dirty old Dutch trone. Her face was a fit picture of the midnight hag that wove a spell of murderous ambition about the soul of Macbeth." Quote, "Young Bender, seen when excited, called a grave-robbing hyena at once to mind." Now, this quote involving Kate may be a trigger warning, so just this is a warning for you. Quote, "Kate proclaimed herself responsible to no one save herself. She professed to be a medium in spiritualism and delivered lectures on that subject. Now, in her lectures, she publicly declared that murder might be a dictation for good, that in what the world might deem villainy, her soul might read bravery, nobility, and humanity. She advocated for free love and denounced all social regulations for the promotion of purity and the prevention of carnality, which she called, quote, miserable requirements of self-constituted society." Now, this is the trigger warning, folks. She maintained carnal relationships with her brother and boldly proclaimed that her right to do so in the following words, found in her lecture manuscript. Quote, "Shall we confine ourselves to a single love and deny our natures their proper sway? Even though it be a brother's passion for his own sister, I say it should not be smothered." End quote. Now to the deaths and disappearances. In May 1871, the body of a man named Jones was discovered in Drum Creek with his throat cut and crushed skull. The owner of the Drum Creek claim was suspected, but no action was ever taken. In February of 1872, the bodies of two men were found with similar injuries to that of Jones. By 1873, reports of people missing who have ever passed through that area had become so common that travelers began to avoid that trail altogether. The area was already widely known for, quote, horse thieves and villains, and vigilance committees often arrested for the disappearances, only for them to be later released by the authorities. Many innocent men under suspicion were also run out of the county by these committees. Now, their downfall started in the winter of 1872. That's when George Newton Longore left Independence, Kansas with his infant daughter, Mary Ann, to resettle in Iowa. They were never seen again. In the spring of 1873, Longore's former neighbor, Dr. William Henry York, went looking for them and questioned homesteaders across the trail. York reached Fort Scott and on March 9th began the return journey to Independence, but he also never arrived. York had two brothers, Ed York in Fort Scott and Colonel Alexander M. York, a Civil War veteran, lawyer, and member of the Kansas State Senate from the Independence. Both knew of William's travel plans, and when he failed to return, began an all-out search for that missing doctor. Colonel York, leading a company of some 50 men, questioned every traveler along the road and visited the area of the homesteads. Now, on March 28th, Colonel York arrived at the Bender's Inn with Mr. Johnson, explaining to them that their brother had gone missing and asking if they'd ever seen him. They admitted that Dr. York stayed with them and suggested the possibility that he had to run in some trouble with Indians. Colonel York agreed that this was possible and remained for dinner. Now, on April 3rd, Colonel York returned to the inn with armed men after learning that a woman fled the inn after Elvira threatened her with knives. Elvira allegedly could not understand English, while the younger Benders denied the claim. When York repeated the claim, Elvira became enraged, saying the woman was a witch who had cursed her coffee and ordered the men to leave her house, revealing for the first time that she had a sense of the English language, and it was much better than she ever let on. Before York left, Kate asked him to return alone the following Friday night, and she would use her clairvoyant abilities to help him find his brother. The men with York were convinced that the Benders and the neighborly family, the Roaches, were guilty and wanted to hang them all, but York insisted that evidence must be found. Now, around the same time, neighboring communities began to make accusations that the Osage community was responsible for all these disappearances, and the Osage Township arranged a meeting in the Harmony Grove schoolhouse. 75 locals attended that meeting, including Colonel York and both John and John Jr. After discussing these disappearances, including that of William York, they agreed to obtain a warrant to search every homestead between Big Creek Hill and Drum Creek. Despite York's strong suspicions regarding the Benders since his visit several weeks earlier, no one had ever watched him, and no one noticed the several days that they had fled. 3 days after the township meeting, Billy Toll was driving cattle past the Bender property when he noticed that the inn was abandoned and the farm animals were unfed. Toll reported the fact that the township trustee, but due to inclement weather, several days lapsed before the abandonment could be investigated. The township trustee called for volunteers, and several hundred turned it out to form a search party that included Colonel York. When the party arrived at the inn, they found the cabin empty of food, clothing, and personal possessions. A bad odor was noticed and traced to the trap door underneath the bed. It was nailed shut. After prying open the trap door, the party found clotted blood on the floor in the empty room underneath. In a 6-foot by 7-foot deep square, at the top of about 3 feet from the bottom, they broke a stone slab floor with a sledgehammer. Found no bodies, but they determined the smell was that of the blood that had soaked into the soil. The men then physically lifted the cabin, moved it to the side, and dug under it, but no bodies were found. Then they probed the ground around the cabin with a metal rod, especially in the disturbed soil of the vegetable garden and orchard, where Dr. York's body was found later that evening, buried face down with his feet barely below the surface. The probing continued until midnight, and another 9 suspected grave sites were marked before the men were satisfied that they had found all and retired for the night. Now, the next morning, another 8 bodies were found with 7 of 9 suspected graves. After this quick message, we'll be right back. Hello there, listeners. Whether you're new or you've been with me from the start, a great way to catch up and dive deeper into the world of mythical true crime is to check out my earlier shows. I've covered everything from Bigfoot to aliens and ghosts. Take a moment and browse through the past episodes, and don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. Your support means everything to me. While one was found in the well, along with several body parts, all but one had their heads bashed in with a hammer, and all their throats were cut. Newspapers reported that these were all indecently mutilated. The body of a young girl was also found, but with no injuries sufficient to cause death. It was speculated that she had been strangled or buried alive. A Kansas newspaper reported that the crowd was so incensed by the findings of these bodies that a friend of the Benders, named Brockman, who was among the onlookers, was hanged from a beam at the inn until unconscious, and then revived, and then interrogated. And when satisfied, they hung him again. After the 3rd hanging, they released him, and he staggered home as, quote, one of the drunken and deranged. A Roman Catholic prayer book was also found in the house, with notes written in German, which were later translated. Text read, Johanna Bender, born July 30, 1848. John Gebhardt came to America on July 1st, 18... unintelligible. Big Slaughter Day, Jan 8th, and Hell Departed. The words of the murder spread quickly, and more than 3,000 people, including reporters from as far away as New York City and Chicago, visited the site. The Bender cabin was later destroyed by souvenir hunters who took everything, including the bricks that lined the cellar to the stones lining the well. State Senator Alexander York offered a $1,000 reward, which would be, into 2023 dollars, $24,428. $1,000 reward for the family's arrest. Now, on May 17th, Kansas Governor Thomas Osborne then offered a $2,000 reward for the apprehension of all four. That would equal $48,856 in today's money. Now, the killing method, it was often conjectured that the guest that was staying in the Benders' beds and breakfast in, the hosts would give the guest a seat of honor at the table, and it was positioned strategically over a trap door into the cellar. With the victim's back to the curtain, Kate would distract the guest, while John, or his son, came up from behind the curtain and struck the guest on the right side of the skull with a hammer. One of the women would then cut the victim's throat to ensure their death, and then the body was dropped through the trap door into the cellar. Once inside the cellar, the body would then be stripped to the bone and later buried somewhere on the property, often in the orchard. Although some of the victims were pretty wealthy, others carried little value, and it was surmised that the Benders typically killed most of them simply for the sheer thrill of it. Testimony from the people who stayed at the Benders Inn and who had managed to escape before they could get killed appeared to support the presumed execution method by the Benders. A man named William Pinkering said that when he had refused to sit near the wagon cloth because the stains on it, Kate Bender had threatened him with a knife, whereupon he fled the premises. A Catholic priest claimed to have seen one of the Bender men concealing a large hammer, at which point he became uncomfortable and quickly departed. Two men who had traveled to the inn to experience Kate Bender's psychic powers stayed for dinner, but refused to sit at the table next to the cloth, instead of preferring to eat their meal at the main shop counter. Kate then became abusive toward them, shortly after the Bender men emerged from behind the cloth. At this point, the customers felt uneasy and decided to leave, a move that almost certainly saved their lives. More than a dozen bullet holes were found in the roof and the sides of the cabin, which the media speculated that some of the victims had attempted to fight back after being hit with the hammer. Now, detectives following wagon tracks discovered the Bender's wagon abandoned with a starving team of horses, with one of the mares lame, just outside of the city limits of Thayer, 19 kilometers north of the inn. It was confirmed that the family had brought tickets to the Leavenworth, Lawrence, and Galveston Railroad for Humboldt. At Chanute, John Jr. and Kate left the train and caught the MK&T train south of the terminus in Red River County, north of Denison, Texas. From there, they traveled to be an outlaw colony thought to be in the border region between Texas and New Mexico. They were not pursued, as lawmen following outlaws into this region often never returned. One detective later claimed that he had traced the pair to the border, where he had found that John Jr. had died of apoplexy. That's where you have a rupture of an internal organ. It's a term formerly referred to what we now know as a stroke. The elder Benders did not leave the train at Humboldt, but instead continued north to Kansas City, where it was believed that they purchased tickets to St. Louis, Missouri. Several groups of vigilantes were formed in search of the Benders. Many stories say that one vigilante group caught up with the Benders and shot all of them but Kate, whom they buried alive. Another group claimed that they had caught the Benders and lynched them before being thrown the bodies into the Verdaz River. Yet another claimed to have killed the Benders during a gunfight and buried their bodies onto the prairie. No one ever claimed the $3,000 reward, however. The story of the Benders' escape spread, and the search continued on and off for the next 50 years. Often two women traveling together were accused of being Kate and her mother. Now, in 1884, it was reported that John Flickering had committed suicide in Lake Michigan. Also, the same year, an elderly man matching John Bender Sr.'s description was arrested in Montana for the murder committed in Salmon, Idaho, where the victim had been killed by a hammer blow to the head. A message requesting positive identification was sent to Cherryvale, but the suspected severed his foot to escape from his leg irons and bled to death. By the time a deputy from Cherryvale arrived, identification was impossible due to decomposition. Despite the lack of identification, the man's skull was displayed as the Pa Bender in the Salmon Saloon until Prohibition forced its closure in 1920, and then the skull disappeared. Whether John Flickering was John Bender is unknown. Now, several weeks after the discovery of these bodies, Addison Roach and his son-in-law William Buxton were arrested as accessories. In total, 12 men, quote, of bad repute in general, would have been arrested, including Brockman, all who had been involved in disposing of the victim's stolen goods. With Milt Cherry was a member of the vigilante committee implicated for forging letters from one of the victims, informing the man's wife that he had arrived safely at his destination, Illinois. Brockman would also be arrested again 23 years later for the rape and murder of his 18-year-old daughter. On October 31st, 1889, it was reported that Miss Almeria Monroe, aka Almeria Griffith, and Miss Sarah Eliza Davis had been arrested in Niles, Michigan, often misreported as Detroit, several weeks earlier for larceny. Now, they were released after being found not guilty, but they were immediately rearrested for the Bender murders. According to the Pittsburgh Dispatch, the daughter of one of these Bender victims, named Miss Frances E. McCain, had reported that the pair of authorities, as early as October, after tracking them down, that Miss McCain's story came up from dreams of her father's murder in particular, which she discussed with Sarah Eliza. The women's identities were later confirmed by two Osage Township witnesses from a tintype photograph. Now, in mid-October, Deputy Sheriff Leroy Dick, the Osage Township trustee who had been heading the investigation in search for the Bender property, arrived in Michigan and arrested the couple on October 30th, following their release on the larceny charges. Miss Monroe resisted, declaring that she would not be taken alive, but was subdued by local deputies. Miss Davis claimed that Ms. Monroe was Elvira Bender, but she was not Kate, and her sister Sarah was. Later, she signed an affidavit to that effect, while Monroe continued to deny the identification and in turn accused Sarah Eliza of being the real Kate Bender. Now, Deputy Sheriff Dick, along with Ms. McCain, escorted the pair to Oswego, Kansas, where 7 members of a 13-member panel confirmed the identification and committed them to a trial. Another of Miss Monroe's daughters, Miss Mary Gardy, later provided an affidavit claiming that her mother, then Almeria Shearer, under the name Almeria Marks, was serving 2 years at a Detroit House of Corrections in 1872 for the manslaughter of her daughter-in-law, Emily Mark. Records of the incarceration back up this affidavit. Now, at this hearing, Miss Monroe denied any knowledge of Shearer or the manslaughter charge and remained incarcerated with her daughter. Originally scheduled for a February 1890 trial, it was held over till May. Miss Monroe now admitted that she had married Mr. Shearer in 1872 and claimed that she had been previously denied. But she did not want the court to know that her name was Shearer at the time and she had been convicted of manslaughter. Their attorney also produced a marriage certificate indicating that Miss Davis had been married in Michigan in 1872, the time when several of the murders were committed. Eyewitnesses of this testimony was given to that of Miss Monroe as Elvira Bender, but Judge Calvin dismissed Miss Mary Gardy's affidavit as she was, quote, chip off the old block. He found the other affidavits support the Gardys were sufficient proof enough that the women could never have been convicted, and he discharged them of both. The affidavits and other papers are missing from the file in the Labette County, so further examination is unfortunately impossible at this point. Several researchers question the ready acceptance of the affidavit's authenticity and suggest that the county was unwilling to accept the expense of boarding the two women for an extended period of time. Now, while the two women were certainly criminals and liars, as their defense attorney admitted, the charges were weak, and many people doubted that their identification was even the Benders in the first place. Now, the list of victims is pretty extensive. Again, it reached all the way from May 1871 with Mr. Jones, all the way to May 1873 with Dr. William York. Now, by including the recovered body parts not matched to their bodies, the finds were speculated to represent the remains of more than 20 victims, except for Mackenzie and York, who were buried in Independence, and the Longhorns, who were buried in Montgomery County. The search of the cabin resulted in the recovery of 3 hammers, a shoe hammer, a claw hammer, and a sledgehammer that apparently matched the indentations on some of the skulls. These hammers were given to the Bender Museum in 1967 by the son of Leroy Dick, the Osage Township trustee who headed the search for the Bender property. The hammers were displayed at the Bender Museum in Cherryvale, Kansas from 1967 to 1978, when the site was acquired to be a fire station. When attempts were made to relocate the museum, it became a point of controversy, with some locals objecting to the town being known as the Bender murder sites. The Bender's artifacts were eventually given to the Cherryvale Museum, which they remain in a wall-mounted display case till this day. A knife with a 4-inch tapered blade was reportedly also found in the mantel clock of the Bender house by Colonel York. Now, in 1923, it was donated to the Kansas Museum of History by York's wife, but it's not on display. It still bears a reddish-brown stain on the blade, which, if you ask, you can see it upon request. A historical marker describing the Bender's crimes is also located in a rest area at the junction of U.S. Route 400 and U.S. Route 169 north of Cherryvale. Now, you might be wondering, according to some news reports from contemporary media, an unnamed man from Kansas City who had investigated the Bender family's house and the rumors of their deaths claimed that the Kelly family, which is another famous serial killer family, were in fact the Benders themselves. The man further elaborated that all the stories of the latter's capture were made up, supposed by the group of Confederates who had also helped the Benders dispose of the murder victims' horses and wagons. He pointed out that both families' modes of operating, that the family unit numbers and other evidence proved that they were the same. Now, also there's a connection to the Ingalls family, which was made famous in the books by Laura Ingalls Wilder and the Little House on the Prairie television series. Lived near Independence, and the Wilders mentioned the Bender family in her writings and speeches. Now, in 1937, she gave a speech at a book fair, which was later transcribed and printed in 1978 September Saturday Evening Post, and also in the 1988 book, A Little House Sampler. She mentioned stopping by at the Bender's Inn, as well as recounting the rumors of the murders spreading throughout the community. She said that her father joined a vigilante hunt for the killers, and when he spoke of later searches, she recalled, "At such times, Pa always said, a strange tone of finality, quote, 'They will never be found.' They were never found, and later I formed my own conclusions why. Some have cast doubt on the story, saying that Wilder had not only 4 years old when her family moved to the area, but that the Benders were exposed in 1873, 2 years after the Ingalls family left." And that concludes tonight's show. I really hope you enjoyed tonight's episode. If you did, comment. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and share this with your friends. You can also consider supporting the show. I have both a Patreon and Buzzsprout link page in the description box below. There you can help me monetarily to continue to bring you great stories. This has been the Mythical True Crime Podcast, part of the Darkcast network of indie podcasters. My name is DJ. Good night. And that concludes another captivating episode, delving into the world of mythical true crime. I appreciate you joining me tonight as we listen to the facts from these true crime tales. Stay tuned for our next episode, where we'll uncover even more mysteries. Until then, thank you for listening to tonight's episode. Good night.